Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you to everyone for being here. Welcome to my first event as a senior visiting fellow in ELIAMEP's Turkey program. I hope we're bringing in a bunch of people from all over the world who are excited to hear about a range of issues that are facing us, us being the United States, Turkey, Greece, the European Union, in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The title of today's event is New President, Old Problems. And we have a lot to talk about, even more than I initially anticipated, based on the CAATSA sanctions that were announced yesterday. So I'm going to kick this off as quickly as possible. I think we have a lot to say, and we'll hopefully have a lot of questions from people. For anyone who hasn't attended one of our events before, ELIAMEP's Turkey program was established in 2020, relatively recently, to promote expert and public dialogue on Turkey, particularly across the Atlantic. And joining us today for our discussion, we have number of friends and colleagues who will have a lot to say about this. We have Henri Barkley, the Cohen Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, as well as the Adjunct Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the on Foreign Relations. We also have Carolyn Rose, an analyst for the Middle East and Europe forecasting firm Geopolitical Futures. She, prior to this, worked as a research assistant for the International Drug Policy Unit's Middle Eastern Initiative at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And her work has been featured in the Center for Global Policy, the Independent, Al Hurra, Foreign Policy Magazine, and the Atlantic Council MENA's Source. And then finally, we have joining us from California, Ryan Gingeras, a professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, the author of 5 books. I haven't actually read all of them, but the 3 that I've read are phenomenal. Most recently, Eternal Dawn, Turkey in the Age of Ataturk. And he reminds us that the views expressed here are not those of the Naval Postgraduate School, the US Navy, the Department of Defense, or any part of the US government. Although from what I've seen, that has not prevented people from suggesting that they are. To begin here, let me turn to Henri. Again, I know the focus of our conversation, which we will be getting to, is the Eastern Mediterranean, but there's so much going on with US-Turkish relations that I think is going to frame that. There's so many questions about the Biden administration's foreign policy writ large, and of course now about the CAATSA sanctions and what those will mean, that I will ask you to kick us off with a broader discussion of all these issues before we move to the geographic focus of our panel today. Henri.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, ELIAMEP, for inviting me. First of all, I also want to commend you, Nick, for organizing the meeting today, just the day after the CAATSA sanctions were announced. Either you knew them in advance or the US government is probably in cahoots with you and decided to make this meeting more interesting. But jokes aside, look, the CAATSA sanctions, a lot has been made, and they were probably coming anyway, because as we know, the Congress has just had voted for the annual National Defense Authorization Act, where it included the CAATSA sanctions again, and asking the president to impose sanctions on Turkey for acquiring the S-400 missiles from Russia. And so President Trump seems to have decided to impose those sanctions, and in some ways maybe, some people say, done a favor to incoming President Biden, even though he doesn't think Biden is going to be president. But nonetheless, it is probably something that the Biden administration will probably benefit from, because it's an issue it doesn't have to decide coming in. But what I would like to do is put the CAATSA sanctions and the whole issue of the S-400s into a broader framework of Turkish-American relations. Because I think when you look at the S-400 decision, Turkey deciding to buy the S-400s from Russia, it is such an emblematic decision that it tells us a great deal about where Turkish-American relations are today. So the S-400 missiles are the top of the line Russian anti-aircraft defense system, which the Turks decided to buy after the failed July 2016 coup. In part, it has to do with the fact that probably Erdogan and company do not trust the US and the West, and they wanted a defense system that was independent of NATO. The problem, of course, is that the S-400 missiles are very sophisticated and also have a radar that's very sophisticated, which creates problems for the new fifth generation fighter aircraft coming out of the assembly lines now, the F-35, of which Turkey was an integral part. And when I say an integral part, not only was Turkey going to buy 100 F-35s, but also was part of the manufacturing process. A great number of parts of F-35 parts were going to be manufactured in Turkey. And Turkey was also going to serve as a hub for the maintenance of a large number of F-35s based not just, of course, in Turkey, but also in Europe. So when you put those two factors together, it's clear that Turkey would have, it was a great boon for Turkey because Turkey would be getting a great deal of money from the export of and the servicing of F-35s. When Turkey decided to buy the S-400s, both U.S. government, Department of Defense, the whole U.S. government, as well as NATO said, please do not buy the S-400s because they will compromise the F-35, which has all this sophisticated stealth technology. And with Russian technicians initially setting up the missile system and the radar, it was quite possible that some of these technologies would fall into Russian hands. The Turks said, no, we're going to go ahead and buy them. The Americans and said, basically, look, if you do that, we will kick you out of the F-35 program. And so you won't get the F-35s, and we will take away the manufacturing process away from you. This is actually an enormous loss for Turkey. And yet, Erdogan decided to go ahead with it. And that's the reason why I think this is a very emblematic decision. Why did Erdogan take such a decision when it is clearly to the disadvantage of Turkey? Yes, the Turkey gets the S-400s, but it doesn't get any of the production process. It doesn't get any technology transfer. The Russians are not about to give any of this to the Turks. And yet it sacrificed the F-35s. So the only explanation I have come up with, and we don't have time to go into alternative explanations, so let me just suggest mine. And I think it has to do with the fact that Erdogan thinks that ultimately the United States and NATO would have succumbed to his wishes and would have made a peace with Turkey buying the S-400s. And why is that the case? Because there has always been a debate in the United States and within NATO about Turkey. And there is two camps, but one camp has always been more dominant. And the dominant camp is the one that says, well, Turkey is far too important to the alliance. Its location, it's the fact that it is the second largest army in the alliance. Its listening post for the Middle East and Iran in particular makes Turkey critical, and therefore you always have to figure out a way to accommodate the Turks, even when they act against our interests, because we cannot, quote unquote, lose Turkey. And I think this is the argument that has always prevailed in Washington, and therefore Erdogan probably thought, and also because the Trump administration has been, until now, very generous and very helpful to the Turks, and Trump has tried to shield Erdogan from criticism about his authoritarianism, about even the S-400 decisions. So I think that it was a gamble that Erdogan took. And I think for the first time, he himself is surprised by the reaction and by the severity, I should say, of the reaction. He thought he could get away with it, and he's not getting away with it. But that, in a nutshell, essentially tells you how Turkey sees its relationship with the West, and how it thinks the West sees Turkey. Well, one thing has definitely changed, and this is important in terms of also understanding the incoming Biden administration, which, look, in fairness to them, we really do not know what they're going to do. They are in the process of setting up shop, and while there are many shall we say, theories suggested or approaches suggested as to what they will do, it will take time for them to make decisions. And but the mood in Washington and in the alliance has changed when it comes to Turkey, because the Turks have been engaged in many different arenas and have started to pursue what I would call a revisionist foreign policy, especially in the region, kind of challenging Western interests very directly, whether it is in Syria or in Libya, or even in Iraq. So there is a reaction developing both in Europe and the United States against Turkey. And there's a sense in which people perceive Erdogan as being too much of a, shall we say, spoiler, that he is undertaking policies that run contrary to Western interests. Now, Erdogan has his own gripes against Turkey, the fact that against the United States, the fact that the United States has partnered with the SDF in Syria, the fact that Fethullah Gulen is still in the United States. I mean, these are the two most important issues that Turkish officials keep bringing up. But especially Turkey's intervention in Syria against the Kurds there that were helping us fight ISIS changed the mood in Washington drastically. And Secretary of State of Defense Mattis, you will remember, resigned basically over this issue. The fact that because he thought that President Trump had not tried to stop the Turks, or in fact actually had given the green light to the Turks. But so the mood has changed. And on top of this, and this is, I'll finish here, on top of this, there is this perception that Turkey is becoming increasingly authoritarian. It has become a one-person state where all decisions are made in the palace. It is no longer a democracy. And to the extent that the incoming Biden administration is going to emphasize the importance of democracy globally, and because there are other problems in NATO with Poland and Hungary, this notion that Turkey, or the perception that Turkey is no longer a democracy, has started to play a much larger role in Western perceptions of Turkey, and therefore you're seeing a shift in that more and more people are suggesting that it is time for Europe and United States to kind of put a red line, if you want, or put a line in the sand where the Turks understand that they're going too far. And we'll talk about the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Eastern Mediterranean is clearly one of these issues that is also triggering this counter-reaction. And let me stop here.
All right, thank you for that. You kind of stole my segue, but that's more or less right. Many of the same issues that the United States feels like it's facing with Turkey, many of the same frustrations, many of the same dynamics do seem to be playing out in an even more dramatic fashion in the Eastern Mediterranean. So let me turn this over to Carolyn to talk about, the more specific regional dynamics. And I know, as I think people have been following this have seen and been sometimes overwhelmed by, there are an incredible number of conflicts that have come together to what now is the East Med conflict. If you wouldn't mind giving us a very brief overview, packing as much of that in as possible for people who haven't been following this super closely, And then, yeah, give us the latest, the EU's thinking with regional countries thinking, how this is likely to play out.
Yes, thank you. I actually have to commend you for a similar reason that Henri did, just because even though we had, CAATSA sanctions this past week, last week was the EU summit where, sanctions against Turkey were on the table. So this is a very timely discussion. So I'll do a bit of an overview of EU-Turkey relations. They fluctuated since the 80s when, Turkey originally submitted their membership application, but recent relations, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, have hit what many think is an all-time low. We've seen the EU gradually harden its position against Turkey over the years, but what's really interesting is that the EU is still very much divided over its policy with Turkey, over potential punitive action against Ankara, and what types of routes they can take in the Eastern Mediterranean. So traditionally, Germany and Brussels, they delegated a lot of leadership on Eastern Mediterranean issues to France over many decades that the EU was conducting policy there, because France was considered one of the leaders of the Eastern or the Southern Mediterranean bloc, and they had invested interests there. Germany didn't necessarily have much interest there for many decades. However, a series of offshore gas discoveries in 2010 and 2011 and 2012, right off the coast of Cyprus, Israel, and a number of other Eastern Mediterranean countries, that shifted some of the plates of geopolitics in the Eastern Mediterranean. All of a sudden, there was a very exciting rush to the Eastern Mediterranean for a number of gas contracts and licensing. And all of a sudden, the maritime boundaries of the Eastern Mediterranean, they were thrown into question and into different consideration. And on top of that, you had political alliances forming as well. You had the energy triangle between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece form, which laid the foundations for the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum that came a few years later. And you had this political shifting between Eastern Mediterranean countries. And of course, one of the notable exclusions was Turkey. Turkey was not included in the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. The Eastern Mediterranean Pipeline, the EastMed pipeline that was planned for 2025, it essentially left Turkish access out of it. It was, a pipeline that was planned to deliver gas to the European continent. And of course, this, in many ways, created a response from Turkey for a more assertive maritime policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, just like Henri mentioned. And then all of a sudden, you saw the EU couldn't necessarily ignore the Eastern Mediterranean problem. It could not ignore Turkey. It had to come up with a policy. Now, Germany and a number of other EU countries, they wanted to engage with Turkey. And therefore, that's why you saw a series of shuttle diplomacy attempts between Joseph Borrell and Heiko Maas, jetting in between Brussels and Ankara to make a series of de-escalatory measures between the EU, many Southern Mediterranean countries, and Turkey. However, you had the Southern Bloc, which is, of course, Greece, Cyprus, and France. They were a bit more hard line on Turkey, and they wanted to see sectional sanctions on different parts of their formal economy, parts of their energy sector, parts of their financial structure. They wanted to see more hardline sanctions placed. So last week, we saw a summit where many believed that the EU would finally take the step to put sanctions on Turkey. However, they gave them a grace period of 3 months. They added a few names of individuals to a current blacklist against Turkey, but said that we're going to explore this again. We're going to initiate an investigation from the European Council. They're going to come back with this report, and we will explore what kind of punitive measures we can take. And I think that's quite interesting. And I think it's very interesting too, because it's coincidental with CAATSA, of course. The EU noted that the US was also making a punitive measure and taking another step and putting pressure on Erdogan and Ankara. And I think that finally we're starting to see, I'm not necessarily sure if it will continue, but some kind of coordination between Brussels and Washington that we did not at all see in this past administration, where they want to, of course, level up pressure on Turkey, but at the same time ensure that it's not too much, it's not overwhelming, and it wouldn't result in any kind of fast or escalatory move in the Eastern Mediterranean against Greece, Cyprus, or any of the Eastern Mediterranean gas forum countries. So I think we're seeing some sort of silent coordination between the US and the EU, which the EU, of course, hopes and expects with a Biden administration.
All right, fantastic. Thank you for that. Now let me turn to Ryan, who I guess some of our viewers have seen, have written a number of articles recently about Turkish naval policy and the Blue Homeland Doctrine, which has gotten an enormous amount of interest and, I won't say enthusiasm, but it's nice to have a doctrine that people can talk about. I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit more about how Turkey's policies on the East Med in particular have evolved and how they fit into Turkey's broader approach to dealing with the U.S. and Europe, and what that looks like from Ankar's point of view and how that's likely to play out. So Ryan.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be, with such an esteemed group of people this morning. I think I'd like to sort of tackle your question in reverse and piggyback a little bit on where Henri left off on. And I think it's sort of understanding a little bit of what American interest is in the Eastern Mediterranean and how it may shape sort of the development of what a U.S. relationship with Turkey will be under the Biden administration. And I would just add really two quick points. And I think one, I think it's really important to understand that Turkey is a seam country. It's a country that within the geographic area of responsibility falls within Europe and European command with respect to the American Armed Forces, same within the State Department. And yet it also is a critical actor within CENTCOM. And it's obviously played an important role within American foreign policy within the Middle East. And I would say that, in both of these cases, Turkey is a peripheral country, not necessarily peripheral in terms of interest or importance, but peripheral in terms in geographic terms. And it's also peripheral with respect to the chief security issues within both of these regions. On the one hand, Russia, the other hand, China. And so I think that structurally, going forward, the Biden administration will have to deal with Turkey. So did I say China? I'm sorry, Russia and Iran. And that within the respect of both of these, these areas, the Biden administration will be dealing with European affairs, principally looking at Russia. The Biden administration will be looking at Middle Eastern affairs, principally looking at Iran. And I think with that in mind, there will be a tendency to see Turkey as, an actor that hopefully will facilitate a much more coherent policy towards these two respective issues. And I think by and large, there is a hesitancy to try to create problems as opposed to trying to work through problems for the greater good being, the addressing of these two chief security issues. And the second issue I would say is much more broadly, I think within the US government is, I don't think the US government is necessarily wired, from the ground up to deal with an ally that is slowly evolving in a direction that is much more adversarial in terms of posturing. I don't think that there's necessarily a good way of, or an innate way within the government to address this issue coherently. And in the end, it comes down to the administration and what the administration says. And so I think that there is, going to be, regardless of sort of what happens, an innate internal resistance within the US government in terms of shifting policy towards Turkey. How do you turn an ally that is, married to you via NATO and had such a strong history of relations? How do you turn that into something else? I think that's just going to be innately somewhat hard. I mean, and you know, sort of moving that into sort of the Eastern Mediterranean, I mean, I think that Turkey understands that the issues that Carolyn addressed really succinctly are, you know, relatively peripheral to sort of mainline U.S. security interests, you know, especially in terms of, you know, maritime issues. I think that especially for the fact that we're talking about an issue in which Russia is at best peripheral, this makes it somewhat peripheral within US maritime thinking. And I think that that's a really important part of the calculus that defines Ankara's approach towards, you know, its immediate sort of maritime space, or what it now refers to as the Blue Homeland or Mavi Vatan. Now, I mean, I'm going to assume that lots of people here, you know, would be watching this, would have a basic understanding of what Mavi Vatan is, but, you know, suffice to say, you know, Mavi, you know, the idea of a blue homeland is the idea of laying a claim, an absolute claim to not simply the surface of the seas in the immediate area around Turkey, but more importantly, what lies below it, within, you know, the rights of an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. And principally, what's at stake here is are the gas deposits that Carolyn discussed. Now, the map that one, you know, sees frequently, especially on the internet, is one that is endorsed seemingly by the Turkish government, although it's not entirely clear how official a lot of these maps are. And if you're unfamiliar with these maps, really easy to find via Google. But I think, you know, what's clear when one looks at these maps is that these are maps that obviously impinge directly on the immediate vicinity of a number of Greek islands, as well as the island of Cyprus writ large. And I think the best way to understand, you know, the idea of the blue homeland is to understand it both as a kind of strategic outlook, but also, I think, for the case of domestic politics, as a kind of branding. You know, in strategic outlook, I mean, I think it's relatively clear that Ankara sees the idea of commanding an absolute right of sovereignty over a rather expansive periphery in its maritime space as a way of not simply exercising influence within the Eastern Mediterranean, but exercising influence globally. After all, we're talking about space through which, you know, untold billions, if not trillions of dollars in commercial traffic travel through. We're talking about perhaps the exploration and the extraction of rather large deposits of natural gas, of gas. So this is something that obviously is, you know, has great strategic value. And then the other element of this, which is the branding part of it, or one could say sort of the marketing part of this, for much of the history of Turkey, maritime issues have been relatively secondary. And that there has never really been any kind of concerted effort on the part of the Turkish government to really play a much more sort of role within its maritime space. It's often within a very collaborative way, and often as a kind of afterthought, especially in security terms, where in this case, you know, the army, you know, issues relating to Turkish territory, specifically, you know, what is perceived as irredentist or insurrectionary movements in Turkey are at stake, namely, obviously, Kurdish issues. And so, you know, the Blue Homeland came about largely as an effort by former senior admirals to try to bring attention to the maritime domain and advocate for a much more robust Turkish foreign policy. And so far, that has paid some dividends. We do definitely see Ankara play a much more aggressive or assertive role within the Aegean, within the Mediterranean to the south with respect to Cyprus and so on. I think that, especially for those of you, you know, who are watching from Greece, and I think that, you know, among the things that is often discussed in Greece is whether or not this is simply an effort or some sort of campaign that is a reaction to domestic politics. In other words, is a way of distracting the Turkish public from, what's really a relatively serious situation economically at home. Obviously, also other political issues with respect to the popularity of Erdogan's AKP. What I would argue is I think that there are several really good reasons to take this seriously and to see it as an issue that will probably grow more serious with time. And I would sort of narrow it down to 3 reasons why I think that you should think this way. And I think the first is, Ankara has invested expansively in its Navy over the last 20, 25 years. And initially, this was a part of a kind of a long-term modernization project, a way of, keeping up, especially with the sorts of demands that are placed upon Turkey as a NATO ally. And that has really shifted over the last 10 years into developing a Navy that is far more expansive. It's far more, far more capable than it ever will be, but also one that has very clearly a competitive advantage vis-a-vis its neighbors. And it should lastly emphasize that this is a Navy that, within 10 to 15 years time will comprise largely platforms that are indigenously produced. And this is something that if one follows Turkish, press or, sort of maritime issues closely, I mean, this is of extreme importance, and that this is believed to be a kind of way of making sure that Turkey would not be subject to sanctions by foreign states in the case of some sort of conflict. Now, I would say that, going forward, this is a really important factor in that it shows that Turkey is planning for the long term with respect to maintaining some sort of naval dominance or sort of competitiveness within the maritime security domain. And this is aimed directly at Greece. And that there's an extreme amount of confidence going forward that Turkey will have an absolute edge vis-a-vis Greek, the Hellenic Navy. And I also would sort of add that, you see this in lots of cases, especially, let's say, in the case of the United States, is that the Turkish Navy, in essence, probably in the future will turn into something of a hammer looking for a nail. You build this big Navy, you got to do something with it. And so therefore, it will look for, there will be a kind of natural, inclination for using this Navy towards, solving problems. The other 2 reasons why I would say that this is important is that I think that Turkish naval circles are relatively conscious of longer term trends globally. And what we're seeing globally is that large powers like China and Russia and the United States are investing in their navies. Those navies are expanding and are becoming much more modernized. And this is also true of navies in ascending powers or presumptive powers like Turkey. And so I think that this is a part of a kind of broader global push in terms of maritime security. And I think the last factor I would mention here is the ideological ones, and that as I've sort of talked about in some of my writings, this is an issue that clearly is something that appeals to the broader spectrum of not simply, sort of the Turkish political party system, but I think within the broader political public. It is a popular policy. And I think that it's not only ideologically gratifying, the idea of Turkey having a big Navy, flexing its muscles in the way other big powers do, but in terms of the way in which it's talked about, it hones in on important tropes within Turkish history, Turkish, sort of perceptions of the world and so on. I have some reasons to why I think that one should perhaps have a little bit of caution in reading too much into Blue Homeland, but I'll stop right there and maybe take that on in terms of questions and answers. So thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all for that. We have a whole lot of material to cover here, ranging from the very broad to the very specific. Let me open it up to questions here. I will send this out in the group chat, but please you can either, If you can respond and write questions in the group chat, feel free to do that. If you cannot, please send your questions to events@eliamep.gr, ELIAMEP.gr. And if you send those questions, I'm sending the address out on the chat. If you send those questions in, we will be eager to answer them. Well, I don't even know where to start out here. We have first question. This is good. This gets to the broader issues at play. First question from Tbilisi. So much seems to hinge on how Turkey and Russia get along. For example, around establishing coordination center in Karabakh. If there is friction, this would tie down more of Ankara's attention. What is your understanding of how this is playing out? And I will expand this beyond just Nagorno-Karabakh to say, as both Henri and Ryan touched on, so much of Turkey's approach to the West seems to hinge on its approach to Russia, in that there is this often very explicit argument from people in Turkey that, look, the West might not like everything that Turkey is doing. The West might not even like the way Turkey is engaging with Russia. But at the end of the day, if Washington in particular, and we can talk about how much this affects people's thinking in Europe, but if Biden wants to take on Russia in a more global sense, and if Washington wants to, we can add Iran to this, take on Iran in the Middle East, that Turkey, even if you don't like everything it's doing, is the one power that you need, the one power that you have to help you do that. And certainly the Nagorno-Karabakh is one of the examples that the Turkish government cites, along with Libya, along with Syria, to claim that it is the one country that's actually standing toe-to-toe with Russia across the region. So I'm curious, well, let me ask all our panelists very quickly, how would you describe the Russian-Turkish relationship, and how do you think that is going to affect, how do you think it is going to affect thinking in Washington and Brussels, and how do you think it should affect thinking in Washington and Brussels? Why don't we start with you, Henri?
Well, look, there are two ways of looking at the Turkish-Russian relationship in the context of the West. One is to say, the way the Turks essentially express it, that, Turkey is too important. And then, as I said earlier, that fits into the kind of the dominant paradigm that, Turkey gets away with things because people are worried about losing Turkey and Turkey being too important. But I would venture an alternative hypothesis, and that is to say that Turkey can play with Russia. Turkey can buy S-400s from Russia. Turkey has a certain amount of freedom of action when it deals with Russia, precisely because it is a member of NATO. That is to say, being a member of NATO makes you in some ways a free rider, because that push comes to shove, you have NATO behind you. NATO is gonna back you up no matter what in your contest with Russia. So Turkey is in this very enviable position where, yes, it is a neighbor of Russia, which is a gigantic power, and it is also a power that is willing to use force when necessary. But it is, therefore, Turkey can challenge Russia when necessary, as it has in Syria, for instance, but has also cooperated with Russia in different theaters. And the buying of the S-400s is exactly the paradox involved here. So my approach is that Turkey has done a very good job of playing this free rider card and maximize its own interests. And we have to also say, in terms of what Ryan said earlier, that Turkey has a definite, at least under Erdogan, a long-term vision, militarily, ideologically, politically, right? And it is using every single card it can to achieve those goals. Look, that's Turkish policy. I mean, you can challenge it, but this is what this is the policy, and you have to deal with it.
Carolyn, would you want to comment a little bit about how the I guess competitive cooperation or cooperative competition between U.S. and Russia, between Turkey and Russia, is playing out specifically in Libya? Because that's, now I think everyone's gotten distracted by Nagorno-Karabakh, but particularly in regard to the Eastern Mediterranean, that was one of the first areas in which this relationship really seemed to take hold, and certainly one that seems of the most concern to the Europeans.
Sure, and I think the term competitive cooperation fits the bill here, because I think too often the Turkish-Russian relationship, it is shrouded in terms of it is too close, or like Turkey's, cuddling up to Moscow. And I think it really is a pendulum that swings back and forth. Turkey, no doubt, uses Russia as leverage with the West and with NATO and Washington, certainly. But at the same time, we have seen instances of getting very close to direct confrontation. And it's not just Libya. Certainly, Turkey backed the government of national accord. Russia backed the Libyan National Army in Libya. And, a few months ago, this year has been a total blur, but between the spring and summer, there was a lot of concern that there'd be an escalation in Libya, and that would be essentially between Russian mercenaries, Turkish-backed troops, also Turkish-backed mercenaries that were sent to Libya. And things came quite close. And the same could be said in Syria as well. I mean, right now, Turkey's consolidating its troops in Idlib province. There have been reports of Russian and regime forces essentially harassing Turkish troops. That's also a very careful line that Turkey and Russia, that they're walking in Syria as well. And even in Nagorno-Karabakh, before we've seen cooperation between peacekeeping forces and this joint center that is going to be controlled by Ankara and Moscow, we also saw quite a bit of concern that there would be some kind of confrontation between Russia and Turkey. And of course, both powers were incredibly careful, and there's the result of cooperation in the end. But there is a very tense mood in any kind of theater that Turkey and Russia engage in. And I think that's also important to remember. So in the future administration, I think it would be very wise for the Biden administration to assess some of these vulnerabilities that Turkey has with Russia. The fact that, Turkey, one of their biggest grievances over the East Med pipeline and over a lot of the policies that the EU has taken with Turkey has been the fact that they also want to reduce reliance on Russian gas and Russian energy sources. And that is one of their complaints, and that's one of their policy aims with some of this. And so I think it would be wise for Washington to take into account that this is where Turkey aligns with Russia. This is where Turkey wants to essentially pivot itself from Moscow. And I think that's going to be very important.
Sorry, could I just, if you have an answer to this, and there may not actually be one. How close do you think Turkey and Russia got to actually fighting in Libya? And I think we've all been watching the situation in Idlib develop. The Turkish government, despite in the past repeatedly backing down when Russia's showed its teeth and shown its willingness to kill Turkish forces, Turkey has poured an enormous amount of soldiers and armor into the province. If it's bluffing, it's a very dramatic bluff. What are the risks of an actual conflict here?
Certainly, there are certainly risks. And I think one of the reasons that Turkey backed down specifically in Syria, not necessarily in Libya as much, and this goes in line with what Henri was saying a bit about how they have a certain level of immunity, but also a certain level of risk being a member of NATO. They couldn't obtain Western assistance in some of the operations they requested US or NATO assistance in against, in the theater of Syria. In Libya, I think it's more of a complicated question, because you also have the involvement of the UAE, you have limited involvement from Egypt, you have involvement from France, from Qatar, from an array of Eastern Mediterranean countries. And I think there too, they were afraid that if there was going to be any kind of escalation, Turkey would A, have to send boots on the ground, or they would have to send any kind of component that would increase, their armored contributions or their contributions to the air defense of Libya and the GNA. And then on top of that, too, I think that they were worried that this actually would be the straw that breaks the camel's back with sanctions in the EU or with the United States. So it's a careful line that they're walking, right? It's, they can send Syrian mercenaries, but when it comes to boots on the ground in Libya, that's a whole other question of, will this be the red line for the West, for our partners? And so while, having that NATO membership is very helpful, and while it allows them to kind of play with Russia, it also can add some risks to a number of their foreign policy ventures.
And so, Ryan, I was actually particularly excited to ask you about Erdogan's recent trip to Baku and his comments about Enver Pasha. I'm aware there may be people in the audience who are not as excited to talk about Enver Pasha as I am. So if you forgive me, I will hold off on this. If you have thoughts on Turkish-Russian relations that you are eager to get to, please jump in. Otherwise, we'll go back to the Eastern Med.
I'll also try to keep it within myself and not talk about Enver Pasha either. I absolutely agree with everything that Henri and Carolyn said. I mean, I think the adjective I use most when I talk about Turkish-Russian relations is that it's a promiscuous relationship, and that that promiscuousness is understood on both ends. And I would add two things. One is it's really hard to know how rationalized the relationship with Russia is, because on one hand, it's very personalistic. And that there is sort of below the palace, a pretty broad spectrum, I think, within sort of the security establishment and within sort of the political establishment in terms of perceptions of Russia. There are clearly pro-Russian factions within the Turkish military historically. How big they are is difficult to say. But there's probably a much bigger middle and perhaps an even more significant, other end of the spectrum, which has pretty negative attitudes towards Russia. I think the only thing to add is also perhaps the Russian, sort of perception of this. And I think that Russia clearly values the relationship, and that Russia gains a great deal by cultivating this relationship with Turkey in a number of different ways. And I would say, again, what makes handicapping the future of this relationship difficult is that so much of it hinges on the personal relationship between Putin and Erdogan. So I don't know. I think that a lot of this seems so much contingency based. I think sort of looking forward, you're going to have questions of whether or not beyond this, Turkey does secure another S-400 battalion, whether Turkey perhaps engages Russia on acquiring some sort of fifth generation fighter, which I think is going to bring in yet another sort of round of tensions that will probably exceed that of the S-400. So there's lots of directions it could go, and I don't think any of them are particularly good.
So on the subject of personal relationships and their impact on all of this, we have a question from Istanbul. President-elect Biden has been known for his long-term friendship with Greece. Do you think this will make him more engaged in the East Med dispute? Would anyone like to hazard some thoughts on this?
I'll hazard just a brief one.
Excellent.
And I think that with respect to Biden's sort of personal inclinations, I think Biden obviously has a lot of personal opinions about foreign policy and is very willing to express them. I think one thing that definitely will help kind of channel whatever his personal interests are vis-a-vis Greece is a sort of developing relationship in the mill-to-mill spectrum. That I think the development of basing rights in Crete, the prospect of the sale of ships to the Hellenic Navy, all bode well for the Greek-US relationship. And I think that a lot of it is not necessarily Turkey related. I mean, I think in some ways within mill-to-mill relations, the relationship itself is the reward, and the expansion of that relationship is the reward, it's, you know, unto itself. And the fact that Greece really wants this relationship itself will act as a driver. And so I think that, you know, again, sort of from the top down, perhaps that's an issue. Biden may have certain, you know, sort of personal interest respect to Greece. I can't really say personally for sure, but definitely from the bottom up, you know, there will be that factor as well to consider.
Anyone else?
I'll add something as well. I think that no matter what, this next administration is looking to deepen ties and engagement with the EU. I mean, I think it says something that the Biden administration said that they're looking to have a summit with the EU and NATO. And of course, the elephant in the room is going to be the policy on Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean. And so in terms of the bilateral relationship with Greece, I think that Washington will still be careful not to make any sweeping gestures with Athens, and still play with that bilateral relationship as leverage with Ankara. I think that the past few months, I remember Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, he decided to visit Greece a few times and also make a series of statements about how Greece could be essentially an alternative for some of our NATO bases there, and how we were looking to deepen military and defense ties. And I think that won't necessarily be the game that the Biden administration will play, but at the same time, know that bilateral relationship is incredibly important, especially in the context of EU engagement. But at the same time, be very careful in what kind of concessions they give, what kind of relationship they're trying to pursue, because if they alienate Turkey too much, at least in the Biden administration's perspective, that could then be a lost cause for trying to de-escalate tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's going to be a careful balance.
I want to add something. Look, the Eastern Med is potentially a very dangerous arena, because not because either Greece or Turkey would like to have a conflict, but accidents happen. Ships have already collided in East Med. You can have a rogue element do something that escalates into a major conflagration. What has changed is that if you look back in 1974, even before the Cyprus invasion, and 1976, Turkey would send exploratory ships into the Aegean, challenging Greece, but didn't make that much of it was not a huge event in those days. Today, it's a bigger event, in part because of who is the president of Turkey, and two, because as Ryan also pointed out, that Turkey now has a much more competent navy that can stand on its own in the Aegean and take on the Greeks if the necessity arises. So the challenge for the Biden administration is, given the inability of the Europeans to essentially calm things down in the Aegean, in conjunction, not necessarily an alliance, but in conjunction with the Europeans, can play a role in terms of setting, if you want, the rules for the Eastern Med and the Aegean, and making sure that this does not escalate into a conflagration. And that's, I think, where the Biden administration can play a very important role. But in order to do that, it will also need to send a message to the Turks that it is willing to bite the bullet and stand up to Ankara when necessary. So it has to kind of show a little bit of willingness to stand up, but at the same time be also conciliatory.
So that actually leads nicely to a subject that's come up in one way or another in a few of the questions that we've gotten, which is basically how far is the United States and possibly Europe now in cooperation with the United States willing to go in standing up to Turkey? I mean, even with the CAATSA sanctions, there's been this long, there's always a discussion of sanctions. CAATSA was delayed for a long time. When it came in, the sanctions weren't quite as harsh as many people thought. The EU has put off sanctions on the Eastern Med. Certainly in the United States, there's always a concern about doing anything that would destabilize Turkey or the region. In the EU, you have plenty of countries whose own banking sectors are, have a very concrete interest in making sure things don't go south in the Turkish economy. How much, especially given that Turkey does seem very determined from a kind of broader ideological perspective, how far is the US or the EU willing to go, and how much of an impact will that make?
Well, let me just say something I meant to say also earlier. Look, the CAATSA sanctions have to be seen generally as being symbolic. Right? They don't have much teeth to it. Yes, it depends also how you apply them. But the real loss to Turkey is not the sanctions that will come either from the EU or CAATSA. It is the fact that they've lost the F-35, right? And the assumption in Turkey was that, yes, the Americans and the Europeans eventually will give in and will let the Turks have everything they had before the F-35s and the manufacturing process. And you already see people writing op-eds in the United States saying, oh yeah, we have to bring the Turks in, we have to figure out ways, maybe, you package the S-400 radar and put it somewhere on the ground and not use it, and therefore bring Turkey back into F-35. I think that ship has sailed, because nobody trusts Erdogan not to bring back the radar, even if you put it somewhere in an underground hangar, not to bring it back 2 years from now. So there's been a break now in terms of the issue of trust between Turkey and Europe on the one, United States and Europe on the one hand, and Turkey on the other, right? But the Turks will realize very soon that being excluded from the F-35 program is a real loss, because that is going to be the platform of the future. Right? The F-16, F-15s are becoming very quickly obsolete. And as Ryan said, what are choices? What is that choice? I mean, they can't, if they were to buy a Russian, the SU, I think it's also a 35 aircraft, then all hell's going to break loose. So I think Turkey is really at an important crossroads, which it hasn't yet faced up to.
I would just add that it's, I can't say what are sort of the future of, kind of, if you want to say sort of deterrence from the EU and US standpoint, whether it's sanctions or whatnot. I mean, I'd say one thing that is difficult, again, to handicap is risk assessment on Ankara's part. I think, Nick, and perhaps you agree with me, we've had these conversations now over the last 5 years over, this precise issue. Would Turkey be willing to throw away billions of dollars and lose, the F-35? And they did it. And not only did they do it, but it's clear that it was used as a vehicle that actually boosted the popularity and, one could say, the legitimacy of Erdogan and in his foreign policy. And so I think even though I think as far as I can tell, the sort of the press reaction this morning towards CAATSA is a little muted. There is, the immediate response from the administration was, you see, this is why we should keep doing what we're doing. We need to have, an independent defense sector. We need to keep showing that we have an independent foreign policy. So, I think that, this is where I think, whether it's from the US standpoint or from the Turkish standpoint, if you can turn a failure into a success, what's the point of means of coercion? I don't know.
Carolyn, do you have anything to add?
I absolutely agree with both Henri and Ryan. I think that Erdogan certainly does not want a repeat of 2018, especially with municipal elections. And Ryan was absolutely correct in that some of these programs, they're certainly tied to credibility and legitimacy. And so I really do think that the AKP and Erdogan, they're certainly going to try and fashion some of these as wins for the parties, and then at the same time sweep a lot of these losses under the rug, so that way they can look towards 2023, or if they have snap elections before that, 2022 or 2021, and try and pull this off as a win. But I think it's really interesting how the US and the EU, especially with such disjointed policies, Erdogan, I think, has taken advantage of this, and especially during the transition. I think Erdogan has definitely taken advantage of trying to make different moves in different theaters, trying to rally up, some of his political base in Turkey. And even when the Biden administration takes office, I think there is going to be a bit of a period where the EU and the US are going to try and collaborate, but it's going to take a while for them to reach some consensus on issues, particularly on what the policy in the Eastern Mediterranean is going to look like, what a rules-based order is going to look like, what kind of rule of law policies they would like to coordinate on between. And I think that Turkey will still have a bit of time and a bit of wiggle room where they can challenge and make different moves in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they've exploited the divergence between Washington and Brussels, and I think they still have a bit of time to do that. But at the same time, their economy is really taking a hit, and that is constraint on Erdogan, and he knows that a poor economy has in the past, it has led to electoral losses. So I think that he's going to also have to be careful. He's going to have to really assess the risks that he's facing.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes left now. Let's try to end on a constructive, if not entirely optimistic note. Part of ELIAMEP's mission is to produce solution-oriented analysis. I am as guilty of this as anyone. It's easy to enumerate all the challenges facing us, but is there, and sometimes actually looking at trying to be optimistic just gives you a better sense of the challenge of this, maybe how this goes, but what are there potential solutions in the Eastern Mediterranean? Are there, either through greater engagement with Turkey or through greater engagement with Turkey prefaced by or backed by some kind of increased US or European pressure, are there actually, is there a way to, and people have suggested this in op-eds, bring Turkey back into the East Med Gas Forum? Would that solve Turkey's concerns? Is there a resolution to the East Med EEZ dispute? Cyprus, Turkey has said it's going to be pursuing a two-state solution on Cyprus. Is it now too late for any kind of resolution on the Cyprus issue? Is there still something to be done there? Let me put it this way. If you were forced to be optimistic and talk about what a solution might look like, could you do that? And if so, what would it be? Anyone want to take a first stab at this?
I can start. I have no specific roadmap, but I do think that if the US and the EU, if they want to tag team this, and if they really want to get serious about resolving the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, they have to recognize that it's not solely a gas dispute. And I think that's been a very common misunderstanding of the Eastern Mediterranean conflict, that this is all over, gas reserves and trying to, delimit different EEZs. It's not necessarily just that. Cyprus certainly is a factor in it. On top of that, too, you have to recognize the Mavi Baton Doctrine, as Ryan mentioned. You have to recognize that a lot of these moves are inherently tied to Turkey's domestic political scene. And you also have to recognize that Turkey's also, like the EU, they're looking to reduce reliance on Russian gas and Russian energy sources. And so with that in mind, I think that the first step would be trying to look within the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, see if there is some sort of concession to either give to Turkey or some way to involve Turkey in these discussions. Also, another thing to re-explore is, different maritime boundaries. And there was this long piece I read the other day, and I know that Henri also retweeted it on Twitter about how there is room for growth, especially with Greece, in assessing the importance of its islands and how they factor into different exclusive economic zones, and how the continental shelf, they're not set in stone. Which I know was, previously said in this discussion as well. They're not, these maps that we're seeing circulated, a lot of them aren't necessarily as concrete as different governments want us to believe that they are. So I think there is any kind of, de-escalatory summit, there'd be a lot on the table, but I think that all cards have to be on the table to essentially assess if you can de-escalate tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a long answer but a pretty big problem.
No, I think that does a good job of capturing both what the grounds for optimism are and also why, again, yes, if this were just a gas dispute, I think the answer would be easier to find. When you get into broader issues, it does become more difficult. Ryan or Henri?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I don't have tons of optimistic things to say. I think that, mostly because and sort of how I would imagine, even if you had some sort of grand, sort of working group or sets of working groups that would, kind of dedicated to looking at, sort of, let's say specifically Turkish-US issues. I hate to say it, we've done this a lot, over the last several years. In a lot of ways, it's been circular. And the truth of the matter is, I think probably this is maybe not optimistic, but I think kind of the more concrete, suggestion that one could come up with is, I think the United States needs a more coherent Turkey policy. And I think that the United States does not, I think there's been a resistance to having a Turkey policy. Turkey is a component in dealing with larger issues. And you don't have policies towards allies, typically, right? Allies are sort of usually worked within a much broader framework. And I think that there is a kind of inherent resistance to specifically identify, the range of issues that set us apart. And I think that, it's sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous. You have to admit you have a problem in order to work through it. And I think we just haven't quite gotten to that point yet.
Final thoughts, Henri?
Well, Ryan, if one goes through with what you said, have a policy on Turkey, right? Because we don't usually have policies on allies. You essentially automatically admit that, as you said, you have a real problem here, and whether or not Turkey is an ally becomes an issue. But I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there needs to be a policy on Turkey, especially because of who Erdogan is and given what his ambitions are. I mean, this is not a one-off thing. This is part of a much larger process. But to go back to the issue of what can be done on the Eastern Med, one first of all has to realize that this is a package deal. It's not just gas, as Caroline said. It's also Cyprus, right? It's also the question of sovereignty over the Aegean. And there is no reason why Turkey and Greece could not make a deal on the Aegean. I mean, it's not as if the Aegean is full of gas and oil and diamonds and gold and stuff like that. It's not that easy to explore, and it's not that easy to get stuff out. And besides, the world is moving in a completely different direction. If you look in terms of climate change, etc., we're moving away from hydrocarbons towards renewables, etc. So it's not as if gas and oil are going to be that important. But there are essentially political issues. And it is also true that the natural and easiest way to export the gas from from Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt, those three countries that found gas, is through Turkey, right? It's the closest line. But how can you have a deal between Turkey and Cyprus when the Turks refuse to recognize the Cypriot government? I mean, so you have some basic elementary problems there. I mean, the Turks recognize the TRNC and they say this, and they talk about the Greek Cypriot administration when the rest of the world talks about Cyprus as an independent country. And so there are some basic, shall we say, conceptual problems that have to be addressed. It's perfectly fine that you have a problem with Cyprus and you want to support the Turks on Cyprus, but recognize the government of Cyprus. If you do that, I think a lot of things will then follow through. It's actually, as I say, it's mostly psychological rather than a big problem. Recognize Cyprus, and then you can have negotiations. You can then, sure, you're going to have differences over the north. Now, the truth is, the decision by Erdogan to push for a two-state solution on Cyprus is actually a terrible step because it really further, shall we say, solidifies that division which I'm talking about in terms of resolving. But imagine for a moment that you had Greece, Egypt and Israel deciding to, Cyprus, deciding to export their gas through Turkey. It resolves so many different problems. Israeli-Turkish relations, Egyptian-Turkish relations, certainly Cyprus, right? So that is probably the way forward. But in order to be able to do that, I think you have to break that psychological barrier. Is that a concrete solution for you, Nick?
No, but that's better than I expected. That's I would love to keep talking about this more. We are unfortunately out of time. First off, my apologies to everyone else who had questions that we were not able to get to. There was far too much to discuss here. But let me thank everyone who submitted questions. Let me thank everyone who tuned in to listen to us. Let me thank all of the panelists for their fantastic contributions to this discussion. And I'd finally, of course, thank ELIAMEP for hosting this. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did and very much look forward to seeing all of you at future events. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.